My name's Kieran, Lyon, psychology teacher. This week I'm summarising the psychology book Passion and Reason, Making Sense of Our Emotions. It's about 300 pages long, published in 1994. It was written by the psychologist Richard Lazarus, and in fact co-written with his wife Bernice Lazarus. Now, Richard Lazarus, let me tell you a little bit about him. He is among the top 100 most cited psychologists of the 20th century. I'm going to tell you a little bit about him in a small amount of time, but first I'm going to tell you about a little bit of history. There's a long philosophical and scientific tradition of thinking of emotion and cognition, thinking and feeling, as being in conflict with each other. Whether you're ruled by your head or by your heart, the idea that we have in a lot of the sciences, in a lot of psychological science, and also, or we used to have in a lot of psychological science, and also in common language, is that you have reason, logical thinking, and you have emotion in the way. That emotion is in the way, and you could kind of understand that because it's difficult to think clearly when you're terrified. But the fundamental problem with that is that that idea, emotion versus reason, reason versus passion, is that emotions are irrational. But this book is saying, no, emotions are not irrational. Emotions are rational. That's why the book is called Passion and Reason, not Passion versus Reason. Now, before we talk about emotion more broadly, we have to go back to talk about stress, because that is what Lazarus was talking about. He was, in fact, the founder of the modern coping literature, and coping is all the ways in which people respond to events to reduce their negative emotion. He was the founder of that field of psychological research back in the 1960s, and then working through the 1980s, he worked with his collaborator Susan Folkman, who used to actually be one of his PhD students, to develop a model of stress and coping. And their model, which is called the transactional model of stress and coping, I'll go through it soon. This was written up in their book Stress, Appraisal and Coping, which they wrote and published in 1984. If you're a psychology student, you've probably heard this before. Lazarus and Folkman, 1984. And so this is the model. And the idea is that if there's a stressful event, whether or not you feel stressed doesn't depend on the event itself. It depends on automatic calculations, decisions that are being made by your brain. So you have the stressor itself, and then the first question is, this stressor, is it a threat? You have all these different things, these 20 things to do for work. You only have a few hours. If you don't care about your job, that's not going to stress you, but it will stress you if you do care about your job. And so the idea is that it's only going to be a stressor if there's a goal and there's a threat, and the stress is a threat in the way of the goal. There's something in the way. And if there is something in the way, the question becomes, well, do you have the resources to solve that problem, to get that thing out of the way? And you could imagine, well, stress is actually a metaphor. At least it used to be. Stress originally was an engineering term. It referred to physical force upon physical structures that could damage them. Physical forces wearing down a bridge, for example. And so you have a car going on the bridge. The weight of the car, is that a stressor? Well, that depends on if it's an old rickety bridge made of wood, or it depends on whether it's a strong bridge made of reinforced concrete. And so whether or not something is a stressor, whether that thing causes stress, depends upon your resources. In terms of psychological stress, the psychological resources we're talking about could include social resources, all the people who could help you. But in terms of true psychological resources, we could think of your own beliefs, your self-esteem, your self-efficacy, whether you believe that you can problem solve. If you want to learn more about self-efficacy, I have a whole video about self-efficacy within this playlist. And so if you think you can problem solve, well, go ahead and do so. But if you don't have the resources, or you don't think you have the resources to problem solve, because it's all about your own perception, then you can use emotion-focused coping to try to reduce negative emotion and reduce the felt sensation of stress. The one main strategy they were talking about in terms of reducing stress, reducing negative emotion, was what they called reappraisal. So we've got these two diamonds in this flowchart I've made. I've tried to simplify the model into a flowchart. Those two diamonds are different. They call them appraisals, which are calculations, judgments being made by your brain. And what you can do to feel less stressed is you can change that judgment, make a new judgment. They call that reappraisal. So instead of thinking, oh no, I have 20 things to do, I'm going to lose my job, it's going to be terrible. Instead, you could think, well, I have 20 things to do. That's the challenge. And if I overcome this challenge, then that's going to prove my own self-worth, and that's going to prove my competence as an employee. And so you can reframe it in terms of challenge rather than threat, rethinking. Sometimes this is called reinterpretation. Sometimes it's called positive reframing. This is still the most studied strategy in the field of emotion regulation. Now, as I said before, we started with stress and coping. And if you want to study people's motivation and you're a psychologist, it's probably a good idea to start with something beneficial, directly beneficial, like helping people with stress. But it turned out that what was true for stress was true for other emotional states. And that is the argument that the Lazaruses are making in this book. So they start by studying stress, and it turns out what's true for stress is true for other emotions. The coping literature, coping with stress, expands into the literature into emotion regulation. And, well, what the Lazaruses say, and this is back in the 1990s, is that there are really 6 different components, nuts and bolts, of different emotions. So first of all, you have the provocation. That's the situation itself. But the thing is that the situation itself doesn't tell you that much about what you're going to feel about it. That depends on your personal meaning. So if someone passes you and glances at you, well, maybe that's no problem whatsoever. But let's imagine that you have biases toward negative information. You interpret the worst, you remember the worst. Well, maybe someone glances at you and you think, oh no, they're thinking the worst of me. They're thinking bad things about me. You feel very anxious. It depends not on the situation itself, but on your map of the world. And then what you do is you then compare that with your personal goal. So is there something in the way? And as well as that, your self or ego. And the way to think about it is that every single emotion has a distinctive drama. That's the phrase they use. Every emotion is for a different goal or a different obstacle. So you could think of your emotion circuitry as being a set of different switches that switch on or off, and they switch on whether if there's an obstacle in the way or if you're moving toward a goal. And that's going to depend on comparing your model of the world to your model of what you think the world should be. If this is starting to sound very similar to the control theory model that I talked about in my video on Carver and Shear, the answer is yes. Carver and Shear came across the same basic idea, comparison with goals, from the motivation side. And Jaak Panksepp came through, and his researchers came through the same kind of idea from the neuroscience side. And that's actually a good thing. We have different areas of psychology all pointing in the same direction, emotions being about goals. So we have these different goals, but on top of the goals, on top of these different goals you need to keep track of, you also have your sense of self, how you think of yourself, which they call your ego. And so you're comparing one to the other, and then the result of that is the appraisal, the automatic judgment, which then produces the emotion, and each emotion has a specific action tendency. It tells you to do something, so it could be run, or it could be fight, or it could be carry on, or it could be look after someone, or it could be give up. And what the Lazaruses do in this book is they actually provide a framework for each of these different emotions. They have categories of emotion, they have the emotion themselves, and also has the appraisal, the situation in which you would feel the emotion. So anxiety, there's uncertain threat, something's wrong, I don't know what it is. Happiness, well done, I'm moving towards something, keep going. Sadness, the threat's so bad that it's destroyed the goal structure, give up, focus on something else. And so you could think of this almost as a user's guide to the emotions, when you should feel different emotions. Well, the challenge with this is that, and this is rather embarrassing, is that psychologists don't actually know how many emotions we have, and we don't really know how to categorize them. So, for example, he's got emotions provoked by favorable conditions and by unfavorable conditions, but he's put that separate to what he calls the nasty emotions, which is like anger, and the whole point of anger is defending yourself and resources, standing up for yourself. It's not obvious to me why that should be separated from negative circumstances. And so the criticism, if there is one, is of the taxonomy of the different emotions, because all different affective scientists have different taxonomies of emotions. So Panksepp's talking about one set of emotions, Ekman's talking about another. There are also researchers such as Russell and also Feldman Barrett, who think that instead of having these discrete emotions, emotions are more on a spectrum. Now, that's a criticism not so much of the book, but a criticism of the broader field. It's not clear where to draw the line, for example, between fear and anxiety, or where to draw the line between jealousy and envy. And so because of that, it's very difficult to have a one-to-one mapping of one cognition per emotion. So the next question would be, well, are these emotions rational? Is this rational thinking? Now, we've determined so far that it's automatic judgments, but the question is, well, is that thinking? Does that deserve the title of thinking? And you could think, well, it's information processing, it's some calculation going on in your brain, but your brain is also deciding on your temperature and your blood pressure and your blood sugar. You wouldn't exactly call that thinking just because your brain's performing a calculation. But Lazarus's argument is, well, yes, it is thinking because it requires higher order types of thinking, higher order cognition. It requires an understanding. These calculations require an understanding of your map of the world, an understanding of your sense of self and of your emotions, and understanding when particular situations could be obstacles in the way. And so, yes, all of these beliefs and all of these thoughts feed into the emotion, and therefore it is thinking, and therefore emotions are rational, the result of this reasoned calculation. The next question becomes, okay, emotions are rational. Then why is it that people have problems with their emotions? Why is it that people get anxious and depressed and have difficulty governing their level of anger? Why is it that people have problems with emotion, disorders of emotion, if emotions are rational? And the answer that the Lazaruses propose is that emotions are rational, but beliefs are not rational, or beliefs are not always rational. Like I said before, you had someone walk past and they look at you, not a problem. But if you have a bias toward negative information, you remember the bad things. If you pay attention toward negative information, you interpret things as being the worst. Someone looks at you and you fit that into your model of the world, and that model of the world is primed to see things the worst, to see the worst in things. Well, that could cause you to feel anxious. And so what happens is that, like I said before, it's not the emotion itself, but your map of the world that is being compared to the model. And so if the map is off, if there's a mistake in the map, we go back to those switches that turn on and off your emotions. I appreciate this is a mixed metaphor, but then if the map's off, if the system is being given bad information, then those switches could misfire, turn on and off at the wrong time. If you want to learn more about this, you could read the Extended Process Model of Emotion by James Gross, most recent model of emotion regulation. Or you could also read the literature into cognitive biases in terms of anxiety and depression. And so, yes, emotions can misfire if you have irrational beliefs. However, the emotions themselves are the result of a complicated process of comparing a lot of different beliefs about the world and comparing the abstract ideas of your own goals, and therefore emotions themselves are not irrational. Emotions are rational. It is reason. It is not reason versus passion. It is passion and reason.